Russians see Witkoff as almost an agent of influence, a kind of unwitting tool to help keep Russia's demands fresh in Trump's heads. But frankly, I don't see anything indicating the Russians are prepared to do any concessions. They're still asking for all of Donbass, which they haven't conquered. They're asking for severe limitations on Ukrainian military. They don't want NATO representation in Ukraine. And they're also talking, which they've never stopped talking about, of a new strategic architecture for Europe, which would deeply harm NATO and NATO's deterrence. So it's very hard to see where this is going other than in Witkoff's fantasies.
Ukraine would have to give up the Donbass and half its armed forces under new peace plans. Leaks suggest the proposals have been worked out between the president's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, an advisor to President Putin. In another worrying sign for Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg has announced his intention to step down as Trump's special envoy. Well, Steve Erlanger is the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
The US seems to be siding with Russia here. What exactly is going on? How much do we know?
Well, this is sour old wine in dirty old bottles, I have to say. There's very little new here. What's new is another effort by the Trump administration, though we don't know where the president sits on this, crucially, to bring what the president considers another war to an end. The problem is there's very little that's changed in the Russian position. Now, the problem has always been, frankly, Donald Trump has bought the Russian narrative on Ukraine. He's never liked Zelenskyy. He admires him a bit for his pluck, but he really believes that Russia has the upper hand and is winning the war, which to some degree it is, but over a very, very long period of time. So we've come back with this Wickoff idea, which is now several months old and has been rejected numerous times by the Ukrainians. What's different now is the president has been angry with Putin and has been putting some pressure on him, including big oil sanctions, which are going into effect in a couple days, which may be the reason this has come up again. The Russians are trying to make sure those sanctions are not or are postponed. And Witkoff has always felt that Russia's position's better. So the big question is, will Trump back his pal Witkoff and try to put more pressure on Zelenskyy in ways that haven't worked before? Zelensky's also in a slightly weaker position because of this extraordinary corruption scandal. Joe Biden always used to say the problem with Ukraine, it was hopelessly corrupt. And Zelensky's very embarrassed by this, as are his European backers, the people who are helping to fund him. And so perhaps there's a perception that Zelensky's in a weaker position. But if he's in a weaker position, he's certainly not going to surrender to Russia, which would be even harder now than it's ever been before. So in a way, I mean, I don't mean to go on about this, but the ideas are not new. What is intriguing is, where does President Trump come down on this, and where is he prepared to put pressure, and on whom? And of course, you'll have European officials like Jonathan Powell and everybody else scrambling around to try to make sure that Trump doesn't yet again side with Putin to the detriment of Europe's security and Ukraine.
And in terms of, I mean, you've mentioned there a couple of times that this is a plan being driven by Steve Witkoff. And actually, I think Wickoff posted online on X accidentally, giving away that this was a plan that was confirmed as a legitimate one. Where is his support for and his sort of desire to work with the Russians coming from? Because Keith Kellogg quit. I mean, there is a debate about whether he quit over this or whether the timing is just a pretty sort of interesting timing. But what is driving Witkoff?
Well, certainly Kellogg, I think, has said he's felt cut out of the whole process, so feels kind of useless. He has been a good voice for for Ukraine. Witkoff is someone Trump trusts, absolutely trusts. I mean, he trusts him more than any of the officials around him. Trump has learned to, I think, begin to trust Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is much more neutral on this question, or even anti-Russian. But Wickoff is his pal. Wickoff has helped him on Gaza, and Wickoff maintains this relationship with Kirill Dmitriev and other Russians. And I think the Russians see Wickoff as almost an agent of influence, a kind of unwitting tool to help keep Russia's demands fresh in Trump's heads. But frankly, I don't see anything indicating the Russians are prepared to do any concessions. They're still asking for all of Donbass, which they haven't conquered. They're asking for severe limitations on Ukrainian military. They don't want NATO representation in Ukraine. And they're also talking, which they've never stopped talking about, of a new strategic architecture for Europe, which would deeply harm NATO and NATO's deterrence. So it's very hard to see where this is going other than in Witkoff's fantasies. But again, Trump, as we know, he's gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this issue, and he may be going back again or forth again, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, and we've seen, I mean, the conversation here in this country has been around increased Russian aggression and boldness towards the UK. I mean, there's been an incident with a Russian vessel off the coast of the UK pointing lasers at military figures here, and that's a step up. So there is obviously pressure. I suppose that the question around corruption is an interesting one. Do you think that President Zelenskyy could be personally forced out because of it? Is he in a very weak position at the moment?
I think domestically there's a big issue, absolutely. The reason he probably isn't already and won't be is because he's the figurehead fighting a war. And Ukrainians understand that to dump Zelenskyy now would severely damage themselves and their relations with Europe and everyone else. But this corruption scandal cuts quite close. No one has suggested that Zelenskyy himself has profited, but the big question are the people very close to him, the defense people, some of his advisors, including Andrei Yermak, who has been his chief advisor, who is a figure with great power, who's widely disliked, who's very difficult. But so far, Yermak and Zelenskyy seem safe, partly because, frankly, it's a country at war, and it's a country that is feeling a bit friendless right now.
It's such a good point. Do we have, just finally, Stephen, do we have any timeline for this? Is there any point in the timeline of, Trump meeting anybody where we think we might get some clarity on what happens with this plan?
Well, not yet. I mean, I think part of the timing is, as I say, tied to Russian efforts to postpone serious American sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, who are two very big Russian oil companies. But it's a very odd thing. I mean, the most telling thing to me is Witkoff is dealing directly with this Putin aid and cutting out Ukraine, which is, one more indication that Witkoff really is, frankly, it's not a very happy phrase, but an unwitting agent of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin.
Stephen, thank you as ever. Great to have your take on everything. Really appreciate your time this morning.